Many thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored, I'm very pleased to be here for the third time. In the 12 years I've been in the job, someone made the point that I have been for very long in this very odd job, and my answer is that probably no one wants to see me doing something else, or no one wants to take my job, one of the two. I've 15 minutes just before the cocktail for explaining a bit the challenges the EU is faced with. And I will start by saying, having been 12 years in this position, that I'm impressed by what the EU has achieved the last 3 or 4 years. Of course, prompted and driven by events, but the way the EU has invested and increased its policy in the field of internal security is pretty impressive. And I must confess that the quality of the conversation is much more interesting than before. This being said, I just want to list some of the challenges where I see we need to do a lot more and we have to address. The first is, but that has been explained, I'm sure, during the day and a half which has already taken place, is the diversity and the complex nature of the threat. When I was appointed, in a way, I wouldn't say it was easy, but we were confronted to one organization, Al-Qaeda, with different branches and franchises, and we were in the hundreds. Now we have many different types of threat. The first has been mentioned several times during these 2 days, homegrown, which leads the head of MI5 to speak of a real shift and not a spike in the change. People who have not traveled to Syria and Iraq, people who have no direct link with the organization, neither Daesh or AQ, but are just inspired and self-radicalized. The challenge here is first the number. Difficult to assess the number, and our member states don't quote often figures, but from the 3 largest member states, we can assess that they have identified, by and large, nearly 20,000 people at some stage of radicalization in the UK, in Germany, and in France. So the first question is, how can we detect signs of radicalization as early as possible? Through community policing, through training better frontliners, by using hotlines, by more and more using big data analytics. But this being said, since being radical is not a crime in itself, the biggest challenge is to determine what I call the tipping point. It's where someone radical starts preparing to mount an attack and falls into violence. And this is a real challenge. If one looks at most of the terrorist attacks in recent months and years in Europe, most of the time our services knew the person. I'm the last one to criticize what they did, but very often the problem was they didn't draw the right conclusions and didn't determine exactly the tipping point, which has recently led the UK government to change a bit the approach in the new iteration of the strategy contest and try to bring and share more intelligence much more widely. MI5 has always been very protective, and rightly so, of the intelligence collected, and more will share at local level. So homegrown. The second one is the returnees, the legacy of the Caliphate. In Europe, and it's very impressive, we've had by and large 5,000 plus of our citizens who went to join Daesh. 1,500 already returned. We know that 1,000, a bit more than 1,000 have been killed, and therefore we have a stock of 2,500 which have either been killed but were not aware. In some battle in Raqqa and Mosul, many have been killed but not identified. Some are still fighting. Some already managed to leave for another hotspot. One has mentioned Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, probably the Sinai. Some may have already moved to Turkey, and some are detained. Here again, challenge to spot them when they return, and it's not very easy. Many can use false genuine passport, and recently in Bulgaria, by the way, very efficiently, the border authority managed to identify a Moroccan traveling with a Syrian passport. The second challenge is to bring them to justice, which raised the question of getting the evidence. Not very easy in many member states to prove and provide the evidence that the people were fighting alongside Daesh or Jabhat al-Nusra. Most of the time, the only evidence available are digital evidence, but with the problem that many of these digital evidence are stored in clouds in the United States, in California, which requires MLA procedure. It's lengthy and cumbersome. We are working on it. And most importantly, manage to get access to battlefield evidence. But there is a culture that we try to change in the army to keep that secret for too long. And the question is, how can we bring that information at the border in real time? The third one is assess the dangerousness of those who return. When you don't have enough evidence to secure a conviction, you need to assess the dangerousness and, if need be, to monitor them 24/7, but it's pretty resource consuming. And finally, disengage those who can be disengaged. So homegrown, returnees. The third one, and I mentioned that, those detained in Syria and Iraq. We have nearly 60 of our citizens detained by the SDF in northern Syria. They cannot hold them forever. We have 1,400 children who were born in Iraq and Syria or who went there with their parents, and 666 women. It's not a secret that our member states are not extremely keen to see some of the detainees coming, sometimes for lack of evidence. And the question is, will our member states and will the European Union be proactive to bring them back home? The fourth category is what I would call the prison leavers, people who have served their sentence but are still very radical when they leave prison. If one looks only at France, the French Minister of Justice mentioned 450 detainees who will be released by end 2019, who are highly radicals. 50 have been sentenced for terrorism, and 400 are just got radicalized in prison. What do? They have served their sentence. You can develop a disengagement program, but probably other measures may should be taken. Electronic bracelet, regular reporting to the police, compulsory disengagement program, but this will be a growing challenge for our member states. And the last category, which I do hesitate to mention because it's very marginal, but has a huge public impact, is of course some of the refugees who were exposed to the Daesh ideology, who have lived in the Daesh-controlled territory, who just get radicalized in Europe because it's not that easy to integrate in our society, who are more vulnerable and are trying to be recruited by some Salafist organization in Europe and may fall into violence. My last point on the threat, and then turning to the policy response, and I'd like to mention, is what I call the Black Swan. I'm very, very impressed by the fact that in 2011, President Obama decided to withdraw the American troops from Iraq because at the time, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was nearly destroyed. 3 years later, a guy called Baghdadi proclaimed the Caliphate in 2014, attracting 4,000 fighters from more than 100 countries in the world. How is it that we have not seen the rise of probably the strongest terrorist organization in the world when the Americans left Iraq? And will we see another Black Swan coming? Are we, do we have developed the forecast, and are we in a position to identify the looming threat? It's a question. Will we see a Daesh 2.0? I was recently in Ramadi in the Al-Anbar province meeting the sheikh who supported the rise of Daesh because they were very upset by the very sectarian policy of the previous Prime Minister of Iraq, Maliki, their message was very clear. Unless we get very quickly a better education, we rebuild the country, we get jobs and support, we will express our disappointment in one way or another. Will we see the merge of AQ and Daesh? One of the best experts on AQ, Ali Soufan, suggested that it, not for the time being, but at some stage the two organizations might get closer to each other, if not merge, because the three reasons, he says, which explain the split between Jabhat al-Nusra and Daesh have nearly disappeared. The first was an ego problem between al-Zawahiri and Baghdadi. The second, when should we set up the Caliphate? Should it be straight away? That was the plan of Daesh, and Al-Qaeda see it as a long-term goal, and the use of violence to impose the ideology and Sharia. So this, and we see more and more in the propaganda of AQ the rise of Hamza bin Laden, which is much more ecumenic and may push for that. So in terms of policy challenges, I will be a bit telegraphic, but there are several ways we need to invest more. The first is, of course, prevent. Counter-violent extremism, or PVE, you name the way you want. In terms of disengagement program, we have started working, or member states have started developing some of them. Inside prison, outside prison, I think we're not there yet. And there is a huge need to invest a lot more in this field. The second is internet, and that was mentioned just before me. We've been working hard. We have set up in Europe a public-private partnership with the big internet companies so as they can remove much more quickly illegal content. We want them to remove that within an hour. We are making progress, but the European Commission will, in the coming weeks, I think, table a draft legislation. I understand Israel has done the same, but the draft is still pending in Parliament. It is a difficult exercise because you have to strike the right balance between free speech and that sort of measures. What maybe should be done more is on the way Google and similar search engines are working, because they tend to create echo chamber in which people are trapped, and that requires some response. We have to do a lot more of mainstreaming of counter-violent extremism, I believe, in Europe, in other policies like education, culture, sports, media, access to jobs, and the Commission is very determined to do that. So CV is one. The second one is, of course, information sharing. The first lesson that the Americans drew after 9/11, where they saw the need to connect the dots. When I'm interviewed on the weaknesses in Europe, most of the time journalists are expecting me to criticize the lack of information sharing in Europe. That was most likely, probably that was the case some years ago, but we've made a lot of progress, and our member states, security service, intelligence service, and law enforcement agencies are now feeding the different EU database a lot. They're exchanging a lot. So my point is not much that we're not sharing enough. The two challenges in terms of creating a genuine information sharing environment, it's more on how can we collect more data in the first place, because you can only share what you have collected in the first place. And the second one is, what do you do with all this data that you have collected and shared? In terms of collection, here we have two serious problems, and not easy to solve. The first one is the growing expectation for privacy and data protection in Europe. This is taken very seriously, and this leads the European Parliament, as well as the European Court of Justice, to be extremely vigilant so that we strike the balance right. But that leads to some problems, because there are some data we need, but we cannot always collect or retain for long. The other one is encryption. As we know, these terrorists were using and are still using social network encrypted, and except in some cases, because it's quite expensive, it's not that easy to get access to content. And so far, the only way to compensate for the non-access to the content, because it was encrypted, was to get access to what is called metadata, i.e. The information that our service providers collect on who sent the mail to whom at what time, who called whom at what time, and so forth. But our Court of Justice, because of privacy concern, decided that the EU legislation in terms of access to and retention of metadata was violating our fundamental rights of privacy and data protection. So in a way, we have a serious problem to solve in Europe, because we cannot get access to the content because of encryption, and at the same time, less and less get access to metadata. And as the Americans say, some of our services are going dark. So collection is one. The other one is what to do with all this data. It's nice to collect more. It's nice to share more. But many services complain because they are confronted to what they call a tsunami of data. And the French have a very good way to put it. They call that infobésité, infobésity. We are fat because of too much data. And as I've said, in many instances, we had the data, but we failed to analyze the data properly. And so a big challenge for all of our services, and again, I'm not criticizing, is to improve the skill of analyzing data. One way the French are doing that, and I really find that very smart, is to enrich the recruitment and the profile of the people they recruit in the intelligence services. Not only police officers with the same training, going to the same school, but psychologists, ethnologues, specialists in IT, and so forth. The other one is the idea launched by the French President Macron to create in Europe an intelligence agency, a European Intelligence Academy, to train all analysts, to bring them together and train them together. And on that front, I had a very interesting discussion here in Israel, because I understand the Shin Bet went through that process some years ago. The third one is high tech. That was alluded to by Boaz Ganor in his speech yesterday evening. My concern is more and more that a lone actor can know, because he can easily sometimes get access to high tech, can mount an attack with catastrophic consequences. Cyber terrorism one day, not for the time being, but I would not be surprised if it does happen before 5 years. Miniaturization, 30 grams of explosive is enough to blow up a plane. Drones, CBRN threat, synthetic bio, and so forth. The disruptive technologies have a lot of potential, and more our services do use them. Just, I mentioned before, big data analytics. More and more our services are using big data analytics to detect suspicious behavior and process big data. Blockchain, I believe we would be well inspired to explore to what extent blockchain could help address the problem of hawala, remittance, and the way to finance terrorism. But at the same time, it is these disruptive technologies carry some risk and create some vulnerabilities, not to mention artificial intelligence. And I'm not sure we have assessed all the potential risks that they could create. We see the risk of deep fake technologies, but quantum computing, Internet of Things, cyber jihad, and cyber terrorism could potentially create additional problems. Then we have two problems. The first, the internal security community in Europe, unlike the defense community, has not really a culture of forward-looking. Just because they are mobilized by day-to-day challenges, they are investing a bit less in forecasting and forward-looking. And one of the challenges is to bring them more together and look at their needs and be in a position to express their need. Europe has earmarked a lot of money to encourage security-related research, but that requires that the professional be in a position to express their need. Finally, public-private partnership. Here again, that was not so far really the culture in Europe. It is developing in the field of terrorist financing, in the field of internet, and I mentioned the Internet Forum, and for the protection of public space, where the Commission has set up a very effective public-private forum. But it has to happen a lot more. And finally, and that's my last point, when I started 12 years ago, not a single euro was invested to support third state in their effort to fight against terrorism. Now we are putting a lot of money, a lot of expertise. We're engaged a lot with our neighbor, and especially our neighbor, because we believe they need a lot of support, because it's our first line of defense. We need to do that a lot more, find the right way to address their need, promote rule of law, good governance, as was said by the previous speakers, address the grievances is very important. The UNDP produces a very interesting report that I encourage you to read, Journey to Africa, which explains really why terrorism and radicalization is on the rise in Africa, probably the next jihad battleground. And Europe is very engaged in development and security. Other challenge externally will be our relationship with our British colleague when they leave. It's a key member state in the fight against terrorism, and it is important to keep a very close relationship with our British friends when they will leave. It is currently discussed in Brussels. And finally, the Transatlantic Cooperation. I've been working on this for the last 25 years, and I've never seen such an intimate and close relationship, and it's important to keep it very alive. So these are some of the challenges we are faced with. The main message that I want to convey is really the determination. I think the EU institution got the message from our citizens when they are asked where they would like to see more Europe. In all the recent polls, instead of mentioning just unemployment, 82% of the citizens would like to see more Europe in the field of security. And I think the President of the Commission, the President of the European the Council got the message, and the EU institutions are really very active in investing in all this. I thank you very much for your attention.